Guys, we are going to be talking about First Corinthians. We're talking about Corinthians chapter 6, verse 4, and 4 through 6, actually. And so we're going to continue our message about guarding our heart, living in a media world, and staying pure. I want you to imagine for a few moments that you live in a house and you have some kids, and one day while you're asleep, these thieves break into your house. They come through the windows. You call the police, and you're very desperate. And if those kids were ever found again, and you get up, and your kids are missing. They've taken all your children. They've disappeared. And you call the police, and you may be very desperate. And if those kids are ever found again, you'll make sure the door is double bolted and the windows are made of unbreakable glass. But what if they were to tell you that thieves are in your home right now, and they're stealing the soul of your children? But they're leaving the body there, so you have to feed the child and clothe the child, but his soul, his heart, belonged to someone or something else. And those thieves happen to be right in your home, and you've welcomed them into your home. Maybe in your child's bedroom, television set, the internet, the Xbox, the iPhone, the iPad, PS4, all those things. And they may already be there stealing your child's soul. Now, I want you to think about a moment from video games. Okay? I want you to think about one of the most popular games there is out there. It's called Grand Theft Auto, right? It's very violent. There's a lot of killing that takes place in it, but there's also a great deal of sexual content. Um, there's prostitutes in there, and you get more points for assaulting them and stealing from them and all this other stuff. There's even a game where you can pretend to be Lee Harvey Oswald and assassinate President Kennedy. And there are many people who allow their kids to have these games, and they don't see any problem with it. And they don't care about God's opinion because they don't really know what their kids are doing. They're just trying to please their children. And yet there's so many people out there who allow their kids to have violent video games or games about sex, and as if God has no opinion about that. When it says so clearly in Psalms that God says, the one who loves violence, my soul hates. God has an opinion about violence, and we know about the statistics. Violent video games, violent and angry children. It's been documented in so many different ways. Now, it's not as if I'm saying there are no good video games. There are games out there where you can train children how to solve problems, and how to build, and what have you, but I've discovered in my reading that even some of those games are designed to be extremely addictive. And that's how they're built. And they design all this so that they train the children how to, to do all that stuff, but they get them so they're hooked and they can't put it down. There was, and this sounds really funny, but there's an insidious game that is no longer on the air. They finally did away with it. It's called Farmville. You guys know about what Farmville was? I played it for a little while. Yet I know people who were so hooked into Farmville that it became their life. Now, you wouldn't think, well, what's so bad about Farmville? Well, Farmville is designed to separate you from money. The way it works is you spend lots of money to buy different things in order to make it work. And people will spend hours upon hours. In fact, I remember hearing a story about a woman was in the hospital and she was dying, and she called her daughter and she says, I want you to come visit me. I want to give you your inheritance. And so the daughter showed up there, and she's thinking, well, mom doesn't have anything. She lives in a little 2-bedroom apartment. She doesn't own a house. We had to sell her car to help pay the medical bills. I don't know what she thinks she's giving me. And so she came in, and she had this will all drawn up, and it said in the will, she bequeathed her daughter her 60-acre farm and all the livestock and all the gifts and all the stuff. And she's like, Mom, you don't own a farm. What are you talking about? Well, it was her Farmville farm. She was bequeathing her daughter because to her, it was a real thing. See, what happens with those games is we begin to use them as babysitters. And so they disconnect from the parents. And they begin to live in that real world. They begin to live in that world disconnected from parents and eventually disconnected from God. So they need to be supervised. And I really think that is a very scary thing to hand a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old an iPad and say, here, go play on this. No, they need to be supervised. Because what you're doing is you're giving control of your child to that video game. And they begin to think like those video games. And little kids really don't necessarily discern the difference between reality and the virtual reality. There's no difference for them. They don't get it yet. So, and then you got the music on places, the pornography on the internet. I was going to tell you that 50% of all teens have accessed pornography and are virtually involved in it on a daily basis. And then I was reading through and I came across an even scarier statistic that the number is more like 80%. 80% of all teenagers are engaged with pornography. Not just boys, but girls too. All of this is happening in our homes. Some kids sleep with their cell phones on so they can get those text messages and others can connect with them. The first thing they do in the morning is grab that cell phone so they catch up on what they missed overnight. And if you want some truly disturbing images, go watch TikTok for a couple minutes. I personally don't have anything to do with TikTok, but what little I've seen of it, it is basically very thinly disguised pornography. And the reality is that what we've done is we'll spend an hour a week in church, and then we'll spend 7 hours a day on the television, on the computer, on our phones. You go to a restaurant, and all the kids are on their video games. They're playing on. They're not talking. They don't talk to each other anymore. They're texting each other. They're playing video games. They're so addicted that they can't have the time to sit there and talk to somebody. That's one of the reasons I challenge you guys to take a 3-day media fast. To spend 3 days without being engaged with media. And I dare say that if I asked you how it went, or spoke to some of the people who are listening to this around the world, I might find that there was a lot of hard time doing that because they're not used to going without having that instant fix. I'll let you in a little secret. My phone stays on the dresser by my bed at night. I'm just as guilty of this too. I struggle in this area too. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the reason my phone is there is because it has an alarm on it. I don't own a clock. My cell phone is my alarm clock. And so I have it there. And what I'll do is it's set to go off at a certain time. And so I'll roll over and turn it off. But I don't look at it. I just flip it off and I get up and start getting ready for work. Because I don't have time to sit there and engage with it. So it's not the first thing I look at every day other than the fact that I'm turning the alarm off. And I'm not one of those people that can get up on their own. I have to have the alarm go off. I no longer have the 4-legged alarm that I used to own. I used to have a 4-legged alarm. He was large, black, 72-pound Labrador Retriever. And at a certain time every morning, he got me up. I didn't need an alarm clock when Licorice was alive. The dog I have now, I love my little dog, but she's not my alarm clock. Licorice was my alarm clock. I had to replace him when he died. And so kids are going without sleep because they're so engaged in their video games. And while we're here worshiping the Lord God, there are people who are plotting to steal the hearts of your children and lead them into addictions. Because it's the addicts who are going to pay the bills. It's the addicts who are going to make the money. I've read about how these people are well funded. They've got lots of money and they have you from cradle to grave. So oftentimes through computers and through television and through videos to capture the heart of your child at one stage and keep it and burden them and lay them down with it. And that's how they make their billions and billions of dollars. They're there plotting to get your child. Believe me, folks, people like Hugh Hefner want your 10-year-old little boy or girl to be addicted so that his kingdom can continue. Because it's all about making money. And that's the world in which we live. True story, a 14-year-old boy is brought up on the mission field. But his parents get a computer and he begins to go off into all of the adult websites because his parents are not paying attention to what he's doing. He does the same when they come home, and then he's found molesting a 6-year-old girl in the neighborhood. Parents are forced to leave the mission field. The kid has to go to counseling. He gets, he's removed from school. He's not allowed to have contact with other kids. And then you might be saying, well, what a horrible child. And believe me, to act on those impulses is a bad thing. But let's face it. He had everything he could pray. Raised in a Christian home, prayed for, probably dedicated, and he gets caught up in those seductive thoughts and images, and they're so embedded in them. That's how they think. That's how powerful the media is. And so that's what we're looking at today. Now, I don't want you to think I'm telling you, well, we should do it without technology. I don't feel that. Okay. My actual job title at work, by the way, just in case you're wondering, is called the Assessment and Technology Facilitator. I oversee all educational learning, technology learning at my school. And so you don't need to write me and tell me I'm bashing other technology. I'm not. Technology can be redeemed. I want to read something to you. It's about a week ago. I read about a man who was on his way to Hong Kong, and on Saturday he gets there and he talks about how, he ends up watching his church service on the internet, and he said what he wrote is this. What occurred to me, I was being blessed by watching this, but I could have easily said, I could listen to this message, or I could just as easily turn on the television and order an X-rated movie, or watched some porn on my computer. But his heart's not there. And where your heart is, there the rest of you follows. And so if you immerse it in filth, what you're going to have is filth come out. It really comes down to where my heart is, and what you said a week before, that we could choose to love God more than sin. I'm thankful for the internet and the media. It's useful. I mean, after all, we've got a podcast, and we televise this, and we broadcast it on YouTube, and we play the podcast, and thank goodness God has really used that podcast. I haven't seen our numbers yet for this year. Like I told you, last month it was like 750. We had 750 followers. Total. I mean, that's not all in one month. That's, we added another 200 last month, but, and I don't know how many we're going to add this month. I'm just thinking about January, but at the beginning of January, when we got our numbers for in February, we had 750 followers. Now I realize that's not, we've got podcasts out there with millions. I don't have a million people listening to this. 750 is pretty amazing, but that's God's doing, not mine. We can use technology if it's redeemed. And I'm thankful for all that. I'm thankful for the opportunity it's given me to pastor this church, to have an impact in Second Life. But what I have to keep in mind is technology is not the God. I'm not here to worship at the feet of Second Life, of the digital learning. I am here because I chose to love the Lord, and this is where He planted me to serve. And so I redeem the technology by using it for ministry. And that's part of what I want you to understand, is that I'm not bashing technology. I'm telling you that it has to be used to glorify God. And if all you're using it is to satisfy yourself, you've missed the point. So yes, of course, the media and technology has its tremendous benefits. And by the way, all of you who are listening to us on live stream or on YouTube or on the podcast, welcome. We're so glad that God was able to use us to encourage you, to build you up. Okay? And this happens to be the next to the last in this series we've talked about, entitled God Guarding Your Heart. Next time, I'm going to end up talking about addictions, and we're going to look into the mind of an addict, and I'm going to tell you what a wife should tell her husband if he's into pornography. That will be the last message in the series, and then I'll have an assignment for some of you that will be rather radical, but I think that as you love God, you're going to be able to do it. I believe that we need to make God the focus and the center of everything, and technology can be used to serve Him, but not use him to serve our technology. So my passage today is from 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to speak on separation. Now, those of us who grew up in the church as young people years ago, um, we used to have always hear about separation. And then my generation came along and said, it's just petty rules, and people think they're righteous because they keep the rules, so separation has fallen out of vogue. And of course, it's true that there are kinds of separation that are really negative. That gives the impression that you are righteous because you get the rules. Rules are able to keep you from certain sins, but they cannot produce righteousness. Okay? About 15 miles from where I live, there's a whole community. There's at least 100,000 people there. Huge community. None of them are hooked on the internet. None of them watch porno. None of them smoke. None of them drink. None of them curse. And it's just south of here. And if you were to see a map of my home, you would see it. It's called the Oceanfront Cemetery. And their negativity does not produce life, if you notice that very carefully. No, not Amish, the cemetery. Even the Amish sin. People who are dead in the grave, they don't do anything. Okay? With that background, you'll notice in 2 Corinthians 6:14, 3 variants in which we must separate. So listen to what it says. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? Okay. So the first thing we need to understand is we need to learn to be separated in binding relationships. We need to be separation. Separation and binding relationships. Now, what I mean by that, it says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? Okay. So let's stop there for a moment. The idea of yoking comes from the Old Testament, where the Bible says that we should not plow with an ox and a donkey in the Old Testament because they're unequally yoked. Now, Paul doesn't say it here, but there's another letter in the Corinthians, the first letter, that helps us to understand that this is certainly applicable to marriage. Now, if you're married to an unbeliever, you should stay married to them. There's another place in the Bible says that God says that if you are married to an unbeliever and they choose to stay with you, you redeem them by being with them. So God blesses you and end up blessing them. And so they stand a better chance of coming to know Jesus. Now, if you're not married to an unbeliever, or you're not married, don't marry an unbeliever, because that's definitely that doesn't solve the problem. Okay? Because what's at your core is not the very thing you love the most. But if you're already married to one, you need to stay there. You need to stay there unless God moves that person to leave. Because sometimes, in fact, that's one of the few places in the Bible it says that a Christian can divorce a non-Christian if the non-Christian chooses not to stay with them and they divorce them. Christian, you cannot start the divorce. Okay? You can't. And they're not a believer, and you are. You stayed married to them as long as God allows it to happen. And if they choose to leave you, well, then you're no longer bound. But so that's one time it says that. And see, if you're married to an unbeliever, but Paul would say that believers should only marry believers. Don't be unequally yoked. He's talking about a commitment that actually indicates our own binding relationship with a person. Clearly, Paul isn't saying that we shouldn't have fellowship with unbelievers. That was part of the Pharisees' problem. They decided that we're not going to have anything to do with anybody who's not Jewish. We're going to call them dogs, and we're going to make fun of them, and we're not going to share about God, and we're going to keep separate that way. They refuse to mingle with sinners and the brokenness of the world. And we see that error, so that's not what Paul is talking about. Of course, we should mingle with the people of the world. What he's talking about is being in a binding relationship. Now, it is not just marriage. Let me point out something. Christians shouldn't bind themselves to unbelieving people in court and then take another believer and bring him before a judge to court. But Paul is saying, therefore, do not have these binding relationships that are going to mislead you, and eventually the yoke is going to be very unbearable. Right? So it's not just separation in marriage, it's separation in a kind of binding relationship, which means Christian and non-Christian. Christian, you should not go into business with a non-Christian. Because what's at your core, the thing that matters to you the most, is your relationship with Jesus Christ. A non-Christian, that's not, they're a slave to sin. They're not going to approach the world you do. They're not going to see things the way you do. If you want to glorify God, then you do not enter into a binding relationship with a non-Christian. Now, if you're already there, you work to redeem them. But understand, you're not going to enter into a binding arrangement with them. Okay? Whether it be marriage, whether it be date, whether engaged, it doesn't matter. Okay? Now, number 2, it says separation in worship. Okay? Let's look at the text. When he says, by the way, what accord has Christ with Belial? Belial is a synonym for Satan, right? So first off, Paul talks about light and darkness. Christ, of course, is over the light. Belial or Satan is over darkness. And he's saying, what do the two have in common? The obvious answer is nothing. Of what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? But now notice this. What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said. I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them. Look, guys, you are the temple of God. Guess who they're worshiping? Their idols are not God. And what he's saying is, because you are a believer and you are the temple of the Holy Spirit and he resides in you, okay, you shouldn't be in relationships, binding relationships, with those who are not part of your faith. Okay. Now, when Paul speaks about the temple of God with idols in Jerusalem, the temple, when it was built,